Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and today we're back in the shop. And our subject today is going to be the evolution of the Derringer pistol. This is going to be a two-part series. In the first part, we're going to talk about muzzleloading Derringers. And in part two of the series, we're going to talk about Derringers in the cartridge era. So let's get to it. Now, these days, I think when most people think about Derringers, they think about a gun that looks something like this. And that is certainly easy to understand because this gun has been in Western movies and television shows since the beginning of time, right? I mean, they're ubiquitous. And it's the vision that we all have in our heads as a Derringer pistol. But actually, the original Derringer pistols didn't look like that. Original Derringer pistols looked like this. Muzzleloading, percussion, cap-fired pistols. And it's an interesting story to see how we progressed from this to this. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, these days, when we see the word Derringer, it's spelled with two R's. And it's a generic term for a type of pistol. But originally, Derringer pistols were spelled with one R because they were all made by a man named Henry Derringer at his gun-making facility in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And Henry spelled his name with one R. And the story of how it picked up two R's is kind of interesting, and I'll tell you that later. But it all started, as I said, with muzzleloading pistols that look like this, made by Henry Derringer in Pennsylvania. You know, we're used to Derringers looking like this, of course, as I said. But I think the first question that we have to answer when we're talking about Derringers is what exactly is a Derringer pistol? And I think there's some confusion about that. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines the word Derringer as a small-barreled pocket pistol. Now, in the Oxford English Dictionary, our British friends define Derringer a little bit differently. They define it as a short-barreled pistol invented by Henry Derringer in 1825. And as it turns out, neither of those definitions are technically correct for what a Derringer is. While it's true that all Derringers are short-barreled small handguns, it is not true that all short-barreled small handguns are Derringers. For instance, snub-nosed revolvers are not Derringers. No one ever calls a snub-nosed revolver a Derringer. Semi-automatic pocket pistols are not Derringers. Once again, you'll find no one calling a small semi-automatic pocket pistol a Derringer. So a Derringer is something quite specific. My definition for a Derringer, and I think this is the correct definition, but I would think that, is this. A Derringer is a short-barreled, non-magazine-fed pistol where each round is loaded directly into the barrel's chamber. In other words, no magazine, no cylinder. As I said earlier, the original Derringer was a brainchild of a Philadelphia gunsmith named Henry Derringer. Now, when Henry Derringer opened his gun shop in Philadelphia, which really, gun shop is kind of a misnomer because it's really more of a small factory. Henry Derringer didn't make all of these guns himself by hand, as an individual gunsmith. He employed a lot of artisans, and he had a going concern. But when Henry Derringer first got into the gun business, it is unlikely that he expected his name to be associated with an entire class of firearms. And what might surprise you is that short-barreled muzzleloading pistol that we associate with Henry Derringer, that's so iconic now, was not actually Henry's bread and butter. And in fact, the Derringer itself, as I'll discuss in a little while, came along pretty late in his career in terms of that short-barreled, pocket pistol. What Henry Derringer was best known for was producing rifles for the U.S. Army. He was under contract to make the Model 1814 rifle and the Model 1817 rifle. And those were two full-sized, combat arms. And that's what his factory was largely dedicated to for most of its existence. Over the course of his career, Derringer built over 20,000 of those Model 1814 and 1817 rifles for the U.S. Army, and they paid him $12.50 for each one that he produced. Now, the rifle business was good for Henry. Besides the military rifles, he also made hunting rifles, your typical, we would call it a Pennsylvania long rifle type of thing. Originally, he made flintlocks, then he made percussion locks, and he made those along with making the military rifles for years. And in fact, in the Philadelphia directory, he was listed right up until 1853, I believe, as a manufacturer of rifles. Pistols were not even mentioned in the description of his business in the business directory in Philadelphia. In fact, we can be pretty certain that 1853 is the first year he was listed in the directory as a pistol manufacturer. But we can also be sure that he made pistols prior to 1853. It's just that he didn't consider it enough of a product line to list that as a substantive part of his business. But what he was known for prior to 1853 were making pairs of high-quality, long-barrel dueling pistols. And he made them both in flintlock and in percussion lock. Always sold in pairs, and they're still highly sought after on the collector's market. He probably didn't start making the short-barrel pocket pistol that he would become famous for until right around 1850 or so. Though we don't have that date nailed down because his records didn't really work like that. But when he started making those short-barrel pistols that ultimately carried his name forward to posterity, they were an immediate success with the shooting public. They sold very well, considering what they were and the type of manufacturing operation that he had. But they did quite well, and his best market was actually in the southern states. In fact, one of his in-house salesmen said that he could sell 12 pairs of Derringer pistols in the southern states for every 4 pairs that he could sell in the northern states, and that by far the southern states were Derringer's best market. Now, that changed somewhat when gold was discovered in California, because by 1850, the number one biggest Derringer market in terms of individual cities was San Francisco. And San Francisco remained his number one market throughout the 1850s. Now, the main era for the original Derringer, for this gun, for its popularity, was basically from 1850 until 1868, when Henry Derringer died and his business closed and all done. So it was a fairly short period of time. Now, during the period where Henry Derringer's pistols were popular, I just want to put it in perspective, because during that same period, Colt's revolvers were pretty much perfected. So Henry Derringer made a pocket pistol. Colt made a pocket pistol, the Model 1849 pocket model, 31 caliber gun. And that gun would go on to be Colt's best-selling cap and ball 6 gun by far. And from 1850 to 1873, Colt sold 340,000 Model 1849 pocket pistols. During roughly that same period, from 1850 until 1868, Derringer probably sold fewer than 16,000 of his Derringer pocket pistols. So Derringers were far less popular than Colts for the same period. So even though it's an iconic gun, it was far overshadowed by the revolver. But it's obvious that for some people, a single shot gun shooting a big bore, they're mostly 45 caliber, 44, 45 caliber. Even with one shot, or two, because they were always sold in pairs, was considered desirable, and perhaps more desirable than Colt's revolvers. And it's not unusual for the Derringers to be carried along with a Colt's revolver or a pair of Colt's revolvers as a backup pistol. And that was fairly common. In fact, we're going to see some examples of that and things that made the Derringer famous. The pocket pistols made by Henry Derringer had some standard characteristics. They were all single shot, short-barreled, percussion cap-fired guns that had a full walnut stock and a back-action lock. Most of them were 45 caliber, 44 if you use the old designation of the bore size, 45 if you use the rifling groove size. Most of them had brass furniture, though you could get gold or silver furniture for additional cost, and there were some very fancy ones made, but not very many of them. Most of them had brass furniture. And they were all rifled. So for a gun that had a 2.5 inch or 3 inch barrel and was made to use across a poker table, it always seemed to me that rifling was totally unnecessary. It's not a target gun. A smoothbore would have done just as well. But they're all rifled and they all have front and rear sights. So, I mean, if there is an odd example of a Derringer that's not rifled, I haven't seen it, but it may certainly exist. I haven't seen all of them. Now, I'm not going to drag you through all of the copies of the Percussion Derringer. There's just no point in that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a couple of slides. And if you want to pause the video to read them or go back and look at them, go for it. These are the major Derringer copies that were out there. Now, there may be some that I'm missing. I'm not going to say that this is an exhaustive list. If you happen to have a Joe Blow & Sons Derringer that's not listed here, by all means, mention it to me in the comments. I'll be happy to learn about it. And I have ignored some of the really small manufacturers, but these are the principal ones I think that you'll find, and I'll list where they're located and generally when they did business. So you can freeze this and just look at them at your heart's content. Derringers, which started off as a proprietary, Henry Derringer's name, started moving to a generic commodity as these copycats came out. And Henry Derringer did do a couple of court cases trying to enforce, because he didn't really have a patent or a copyright on it, but trying to enforce, you might say, what we call trade dress today. And that Derringer refers to his pistols. But that was really a finger in the dike. And when he died, his company went out of business and nobody attempted to stop that. And the name became a generic name. And it also went from being spelled with one R, like Henry Derringer spelled it, to being spelled with two R's. And a lot of people think that was done as some sort of legal maneuver to get around using the Derringer name. But that's actually not the case, and I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. So, as I said, we got a popular gun, proprietary gun, and somehow it moved from being a proprietary gun associated with one individual maker to being a generic, basically firearms archetype that still exists today. And how did that happen? And the answer was a surprise to me, because a number of historians think that it happened because of 3 high-profile murder cases that made their way into the national press. And of course, in the 19th century, newspapers were ubiquitous. Everybody read the newspaper. Today, for a lot of you, you may never have even seen a newspaper, the younger among you. I mean, in my day, newspapers were still being read by everybody when I was young, and a young man even. And I even did some writing for newspapers, even in my 40s. But the fact is, newspapers are dead as doornails today. But there was a time when newspapers and periodicals like Leslie's Magazine and Harper's Magazine absolutely dominated the national consciousness, like television today, really. And everybody read them, and everybody could afford them, and they're what shaped the national consciousness. And Derringer appeared in a few stories that were nationally carried that ended up branding his name across the public consciousness. There are 3 high-profile murder cases. And I think what's interesting is, in 2 of them, the Derringer was not even the murder weapon. So it's kind of amazing that it had that effect. So the first case occurred in San Francisco, no big surprise, on November 17th in 1855. Charles Cora, who was a professional gambler, shot and killed United States Marshal William H. Richardson. And the way that happened is kind of interesting, and very much San Francisco of the period. So Charles Cora was married to Belle Cora. Belle Cora was one of the most popular prostitutes in San Francisco during the Gold Rush era, which would almost make her a respectable person, but not quite. So one night, her and her husband attended the theater, a legitimate theater, to see a play. And the Marshal Richardson, objected to her presence. He thought that her being in public in that venue was an affront to the good ladies of San Francisco. And he was not going to stand for it. So to protect the sensibilities of the good ladies of San Francisco, Sheriff Richardson drew his Derringer and at gunpoint ordered Belle Cora from the theater. And I guess she and her husband meekly left. But Charles Cora was not the kind of man to just accept that kind of insult to his wife. So the next day, he was armed, and he was looking for Richardson. And when he found him, they had a bit of an altercation. And Cora grabbed Richardson's collar, jerked him close in, put a revolver to his chest, and fired 3 shots into him, which dropped Richardson like a stone. The newspapers widely reported that affair. They reported that Richardson had ordered Belle Cora out with his Derringer. They reported that Richardson always carried a pair of Derringers, and that they were found in his pockets on his dead body after the killing. And that was all over the press, and that helped to put the Derringer firmly in people's minds as a weapon used out west in the wild gold rush. The second case was the killing of Daniel Barton Key. The second case was the killing of Philip Barton Key. Key was a district attorney in Washington, D.C., and he was also the son of the composer of our national anthem, Francis Scott Key. And Key was also a notorious womanizer. His killer was Daniel E. Sickles, who was at the time a U.S. congressman from New York. Now, Sickles was also a notorious womanizer, but that appears to have been considered to be beside the point. The whole business started when Representative Sickles received an anonymous letter saying his wife was having an affair with Mr. Key. Now, by all accounts, that affair was highly open, so it's strange that Sickles didn't know about it until he got the letter, but so be it. So soon after getting the letter, Sickles saw Daniel Key on the street in front of Sickles' house. He saw Key pull a handkerchief from his pocket and wave it over his head. Sickles believed that he was watching Key give a secret signal to Sickles' wife. So an enraged Sickles sought out Key. He found him in Washington, D.C.'s Lafayette Square, and he shot him in the groin. He said, "You villain, you have dishonored my house and you must die." And after shooting him in the groin, he shot him again in the chest, and he would have shot him directly in the head, but the gun misfired. Now, at that point, Sickles dropped a gun beside the body and fled the scene. And the gun that Sickles dropped was a Derringer, even though he apparently killed Key with a revolver. But when the Derringer was recovered, the police noted that the cap had fallen off of the nipple. So it's possible he had a revolver that only had 2 shots loaded. He fired them, pulled the Derringer, and attempted to put a third shot into Key and discovered there was no nipple on the Derringer and he dropped it. But whatever happened, whether the Derringer was an intended murder weapon or not, he dropped it by the body. And when he fled the scene, he disposed of the revolver and it was never found. So even though the Derringer was not the actual murder weapon in the case, because the revolver was never found, the Derringer got a lot of play in the press. And the story was widely covered in newspapers and magazines of the time. And one of the reasons that it got as much ink as it did is because Sickles, during his murder trial, became the first man in the country to ever be acquitted due to temporary insanity. And Sickles, of course, later served as a general during the Civil War in the Union Army, where he rather famously mispositioned his troops during the Battle of Gettysburg. So, because the participants were so famous, and because the affair was so juicy and notorious, this story got a lot of press, and the Derringer, of course, received a lot of ink and was branded in the American consciousness. Now, the third case is one where the Derringer absolutely was the murder weapon, and that was the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in Ford's Theater by Booth. And in that case, he used an actual muzzleloading Derringer, Philadelphia Derringer. And of course, you can imagine the amount of ink spilled over that. And that cemented the Derringer in people's minds as a deadly, small-barreled weapon. And historians think that those stories are what eventually led to the Derringer becoming a generic word instead of a proprietary word and his owner's name. And as far as why it was spelled with 2 R's instead of 1 R, this is so typical of editors that, and of course in those days they didn't have the internet, that the newspaper editors all assumed that the correct spelling of Derringer had 2 R's. because that is the most common spelling of the name Derringer here in the United States at the time. So they assumed that one R was an error, and they corrected that in their copy. And the 2R Derringer lives on forever because it appeared in print so many times that way that it became the accepted version of spelling the gun. And Henry Deringer's name fell by the wayside. So that's how we got the Derringer as a generic name for the whole archetype of short-barreled pocket pistols. Now, Henry Derringer himself died in 1868, right at the dawn of the cartridge firing era. But it's as a cartridge gun that Derringers found their greatest expression. Henry certainly never made any himself. In part 2 of this series, we're going to discuss Derringers and the cartridge era, and I'm going to try to cover as many of the known variants as possible in the 19th century, 20th century, and 21st century. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you next week. Till then, bye.